Good afternoon, everybody. This is Communications for Outer Space Activities. If you are a communications person who is space curious, or you're a space person hoping to learn more about how to communicate space, you are in the right place. My name is Jordan Malagrana. I'm the moderator for today's discussion and workshop. I'm an affiliate instructor here at the University of Washington's Communication Leadership Program, also the CEO of Block by Block Creative, a communications company in Seattle. I am also a massive space nerd, have been since I was a kid. I used to idolize astronauts. I watched science fiction, and I was and I am deeply interested in how the challenges of working in space can help bring the world together. It wasn't until recently, though, I realized that someone like me, whose background is in communications and media, not rocket science, could have a role to play in space. Someone needs to be out there educating and engaging the public on space issues, which of course affects everybody on the planet. And storytelling and communications are the best tools for that job. Now is an incredible time to get involved. So we are gathered here today on the anniversary of the Apollo moon landing, the first Apollo moon landing, and just this morning, Blue Origin had its first human space flight. That's a really good symbol of how this landscape has changed dramatically. We now have multiple nations, companies, NGOs, they're all launching their own space activities. It is a new world. That new world needs you, my fellow communicators. Today, hopefully you'll start to learn how you might fit into that. Next up, I'm going to introduce you to our incredible panel of space communicators who have called in from all across the country. We're going to have a brief discussion first, and then we'll do a Q&A right after. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop those into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can during that section. Later, we're going to break into groups, and you'll have a chance to actually practice some space communication and get some live feedback from our panel. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit of time to have a brief discussion about how you can get into the space if you'd like. All right. So as for people who just joined us, it looks like everybody's doing a great job of keeping themselves on mute because we are all here in the same meeting. This is not a webinar. So please keep yourselves on mute so we can hear our panelists as we have this first bit of discussion. I am now going to throw it over to those panelists to introduce themselves. I've asked them to keep their intros really short. If you want to learn more about them, we have posted the full bios on the event page for this event, which we will drop in the chat if you'd like to read about them some more. But now I'm going to pass it to Lila and have everybody just introduce themselves.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for having me. My name is Lila Gislason. I am the Chief of Marketing and co-founder of Foundation for the Future. We are a nonprofit focused on space infrastructure development. We can touch on that more, but that's my quick intro. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome. Trevor, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Heyman. I lead communications at Planet, and I'm also the chief of staff there. I've been there for about 6 years. Looking forward to this discussion, being here with this group and hearing what everyone has to say. Thank you.
Dave, I believe you're next.
All right, I'm Dave Hebert. I'm the VP of Global Marketing and Communications at Astroscale, based out of Astroscale US. Specifically, we are an on-orbit servicing company that is bringing sustainability to space operations and the space environment.
Sylvester?
Hey everybody, my name is Sylvester Placid. I'm a communication strategist at NASA and I've been in this role for about 3 years now. And I do everything from communications planning to day-to-day communications for my program office here at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And super excited to be on with all of you all today.
Great. And Mark, over to you.
Yeah, and I'm Mark Starr, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., part of the Smithsonian Institution. Been here for about 3 years, and before that, spent about 16 years doing aerospace communications for the Boeing Company. And excited about being here with this great group today. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. For those who are just joining the session, as we mentioned in the chat, is a great link out to learn more about our panelists, and we'll post some more information later in the event as well. But let's get into it. We're going to have a few panel discussions here. We have folks from industry, we have folks from government, folks from NGOs. Let me throw this question out to the panel, which is just simply, as communicators, who do you think of as your main audiences? And when you're communicating about space, what are some of the challenges that you encounter as you go out into the world, and how do you address those? And Trevor, you were off mute first, I think.
It's like Jeopardy. Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. And I think from my perspective, as a smaller company that's growing, I didn't touch on it, Planet builds and operates about 200 satellites that take images, similar imagery you see in Google Maps. And so for us, our audience is our customers, and that audience includes farmers and people within government and people just generally in technology, and people building their own startups that want to analyze the data using machine learning. So it's pretty specific. Planet just recently announced that it's going to be going public. So now all of a sudden our audience is investors, which is somewhat different. In both instances, these are not space focused audiences, right? They don't really understand how our business works and the mechanics of it. And so we are always sort of navigating this fine line between wanting to talk about the space aspect because it's interesting and fun and draws a lot of attention, but also needing to get people to focus on what our real core business is, which is selling data, which frankly has nothing to do with space. And so, but again, there's a lot of pros and cons there about how we do that.
Well, so you mentioned farmers. How do you talk to farmers about space? And I think farmers is a good analog for a lot of the audiences that we all try to talk to about this kind of thing. You may not immediately understand the connection between what they do and what you do.
Yeah, so we really focus on how we're different and why being in space gives us an advantage over other data sets they might be able to use, right? So in space, you're able to capture much more data at a much lower cost, just because of the scale of what you're doing and the perspective and the distance from the Earth that you're at. Whereas with maybe we're competing against aerial data, so data from planes, right? They're much closer to the Earth, so what they're looking at is a much smaller swath of information they're able to collect at once. And it's a much higher cost. You've got regulation costs for the planes and fuel and pilots and things like this. So that's sort of how we talk about it, right? You would think that space and satellites would be expensive, but actually at scale, the cost come down dramatically when you're looking at very wide areas. So for us, we talk about space in the sense that it's very efficient, and it's always on, and it's something that the satellites are up there, they're orbiting, they're doing their work, they're collecting the data, and it's an always on data set versus something that may not require a little bit more effort and planning to acquire.
So anybody else are trying to connect space to what somebody themselves might sing in their business life or their personal life? How do you make those connections?
So I'll go and I'll probably say something that will be surprising for some people to hear, but in my job, specifically in my role, I hardly ever talk about space. The reason for that is I actually work as a communication strategist within the office of the Chief Information Officer at NASA. So my primary role is with all of the IT support services that NASA provides across the agency. We are there to literally help people do their jobs with computers, laptops, network connections, phones, WebEx, Microsoft Teams. So all of the communication that I manage has to do with the IT that enables people at NASA to do their job. So while we are part of the mission to go to space, my program doesn't have to do directly with that. So a lot of the communications and audiences that I have are somewhat removed from the folks that are kind of on the front lines and helping to get equipment and people up into space. So a lot of the things that I do on a daily basis are very practical and not that different from some of the other corporate communications jobs that I've had at consulting companies, both small and large, or aerospace and defense companies. So it's important. One of the things that I really like about this conversation that we're having, one of the intents for today, is that you don't have to necessarily come from a space background in order to have a job supporting space. And I'm definitely an example of that, in that what I do every day is not that dissimilar from some of the roles that some of you have either held in the past or maybe interviewing for now.
So Mark, I saw you come off of mute there.
Yeah, so we have in a normal year several million people walk through the door, so we like to joke that our audience is everyone, but as a communicator that makes things I guess more of a challenge. But we are an organization dedicated to commemorating, educating, and inspiring our visitors. And so a key target for us is the folks who are going to be the next generation of people working in all these hundreds of thousands of roles that can support those who actually go out and explore in space. And you could be an astronaut, but you can also be a communicator. And so one of our major efforts now is to how do we make people see themselves in the stories. And so we're really looking at how do we expand the stories we tell, how do we make sure we present them in a way that's approachable to a variety of audiences, so that everybody who comes through the door goes, oh, there's a piece of that. And that's the thing, is it doesn't have to be the astronaut piece, it could be the storyteller piece, it could be the artist piece, whatever that is. But how do we make that connection so that they can again see a role for themselves and hopefully be inspired to be someone that we then get to celebrate and pass along to the next generation.
Yeah. Lila, I know you focus on this quite a bit. You're always trying to connect space to people's everyday life. Maybe jump in here real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are an education and advocacy nonprofit, so we have multiple audiences as well. And on the advocacy side, obviously it's government officials, and on the education side, it's everybody really. And sort of within that bucket, we've got the industry, the space industry, and then also, the general public. I think there are a lot of people who are enthusiastic about space, who already have quite a bit of knowledge about space, that space is sort of real for them, whereas a lot of people, most people, don't see space as real at all. They kind of see it as this far off thing, and it's abstract, and how does it relate to me? So yeah, when you've got multiple audiences, it's kind of difficult, but it does, as you mentioned, help to sort of tie it to something that they understand. We actually like to say that we want to make space boring. And it sounds kind of strange, but what that means, since we do space infrastructure, is that we want to put the boring stuff in place, the roads, the rails, and the sewers. And so people start to understand kind of in Earth terms what that means. In order to build out an industry, you have to put the infrastructure in place. So yeah, little tools and tricks like that help.
Just real quick before we, Dave, I want to have you answer this as well, but just real quick, what is the infrastructure for space? What do you mean by that? And how does just the average non-space person relate to that?
Yeah, well, I think, just as you mentioned today, we saw Blue Origin go into space. That's such a tiny piece of the space landscape right now. There are a lot of companies who are eager to develop new launch technologies. There are people who want to live and work in space, and may not be next year, but probably 10 years from now, we will have people working in space on a regular basis. And it won't just be astronauts. We're looking at, jobs that you might see here, like HVAC technicians or, welders, all kinds of things like that. So a lot of blue collar jobs, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's going to need to be built to create a thriving space economy. So it's all the stuff that supports getting up into space.
That's great. So Dave, I'll throw it to you. I'll ask you the same question I asked them, which is just challenges that you see, but I'll also ask you when you're done with that, maybe to pivot over and talk about something that excites you about talking about space too.
Sure. And Lila, that was a beautiful setup when talking about space infrastructure. So first, our primary audience is satellite operators on the commercial and government side, and those who have significant input into operations when it comes to technology, business models and markets, and policy. So what we're trying to do is expand their mind about what's possible in space operation. And if you'll indulge me in an analogy, I'll hopefully explain what I mean by that and get back to this great point about infrastructure. Imagine you have just bought a brand new car, a really nice car, and you drive it off the lot and you get on the freeway, but then you're stuck on the freeway. You can't exit, you can't go anywhere else, you just have to stay on the freeway. And then imagine that the car starts making funny noises or throws a check engine light, but you can't go to the mechanic, you can't get out of the car and pop the hood, you can't check the tires, you can't do anything about it. And then finally, when that car runs out of its first tank of gas or its first battery charge, you just have to abandon it on that crowded speeding freeway and leave it there. Now, this, of course, is absurd in terms of the way that we own and operate cars, but this has essentially been the way that satellite operators have had to do things since the dawn of the space age, since Sputnik over 60 years ago. And that is because they've had to build satellites as if they would build and launch satellites as if they would never see or touch them again. And what's happening over 60 years of operating that way is operators are decreasing their ROI and they're increasing risk. They're increasing the risk that their satellite's going to collide with other satellites, that their satellite's going to become debris and become a problem maybe to their other assets or other people's assets. They're decreasing ROI by, we have satellite operators who build satellites that are literally worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And then when they run out of fuel and they're otherwise still functioning, they just let them go, literally money drifting through space. So what we're trying to do through on-orbit servicing, which gets back to this infrastructure question, is bring things that we have taken for granted on Earth, traffic management and being able to inspect things and maintain things, tow trucks, manufacturing, building things in space, or building things on Earth, and bring those concepts to orbit where they apply. And that ties back to humanity at large in ways that have already been touched on here. Space has brought modern life to what it is today in communication, navigation, finances, weather warnings, climate monitoring, national security warnings. We have these projections of $1 trillion plus space economy, but we don't have a plan across the space sector on how we're going to build that in-orbit infrastructure versus just throwing satellites up there and hoping it all works out. And so what we're proposing is that economy has to be built on sustainable in-orbit infrastructure in order for it to thrive and continue to provide the benefits we already enjoy and new ones that we haven't even thought of yet.
And when the picture you all are painting are of this new world, people are in space, we have tow trucks in space, we have all this stuff going on in space, and we need a plan and all that. But I'm willing to bet that a lot of people may not realize that that's already happening. Like we're kind of in that already. You know, the flight this morning made news and people watched the Branson flight last week, and that kind of maybe people glance at. But how are you communicating to everybody else that there are all of these possible futures, no matter kind of what you want to do, if you're an architect or doctor, whatever, how are you getting to people and making them understand that?
It's interesting. So as you may know, we're redoing the main building down here on the National Mall, and literally, again, those are sort of very core to what we're doing. We actually have one of the new galleries is going to be One World Connected. One's going to be called Futures in Space, and one's going to be called Living in the Space Age. So and Lila had on it. It's making that connection to here's how all these things that have happened in the past and now in the present, we're going to talk about as well, are impacting your day-to-day life. Because it is, I mean, as Dave said, you have to make that connection or people aren't aware of it. And then look at what are those future technologies that are most likely to be able to have the greatest impact on our lives. It's we try to, the Bill Anders quote that, he said, we went to the moon and the thing that we discovered was the Earth. And it's making that connection that everything we do in space is about life here. And so, looking for all the creative ways we can to emphasize that so that people do get invested. I was looking back as one of our historians mentioned it. The only time the Apollo program was positive, got like positive polling numbers, was right around this week in 1969. In February, it was underwater in terms of positivity for the program. And a few months after we landed, it was under. So it's a challenge for communicators and has been for decades. So it's not something new. And it's something that, we all need, who love this stuff so much, needs to be aware of when we're going out, realizing that not everybody else is.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. We're very explicit about it just because we find that we're frequently sort of lumped in or even left out because there's so much buzz around space tourism or really looking out deep, or if you're talking about going to Mars and things like this, or the moon. Whereas really the impact of space here on Earth is massive. It has been for a long time, per Dave's point, and Mark's, but also it's ever more so increasing with the technology that's going into space now, and the real impact that people will feel day to day, whether that be a farmer or anyone here, is going to be back here on Earth based on what the data and the different communications capabilities are able to deliver. And so we're very, very explicit about it. We talk about it a lot just because we really want to bring that focus back. And we also try to say, we really envision what's happening in space right now, especially on the commercial side. 10 years from now, we're going to look back, and the things that we're touching and feeling and experiencing in their connection to space, we'll look back at this time and say, how do we live then with what we have now? Sort of how we think about how we lived before having cell phones and be able to text our friends. We really feel like what's happening in space right now is going to lead to an outcome in 10 years that's going to be substantially different on its impact and the way it impacts all of our lives. So we try to make that case a lot. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Bloomberg just put out an article last week. Ashley Vance wrote it, and it's great. He talks about this race to space between Bezos and Elon and Branson. And then he just says, but there's a lot of really amazing things that space is doing here on Earth and with climate. And I saw the question in the chat here about the SDGs. And he says, maybe if the billionaires put their space egos away a little bit and focus more here on Earth, we might see some of those positive impacts here too.
Just to add on to that, Lila's been talking a lot about, her foundation wants to try to make space boring. I think in some ways we're there. I think about the Apollo days and how, a single Saturn V launch was, the national story for weeks, if not months. And that was a huge deal. And now we have so many launches, both from our agency at NASA, international launches, China's got so many missions. Our partners in Russia have cargo resupply missions. We have a lot of commercial missions that are happening. Last week was Virgin Galactic. This week was Blue Origin. SpaceX has so many operations. It's to the point now where there are some launches that are so routine that there are times that I even forget which launch is going up on what day. And I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, the shuttle missions, even shuttle missions were on a pretty good cadence, once every couple of months, and those were still exciting. And so, now to the point where it's like, okay, who's going to be next to go up? Who's got the capital to be able to send a vehicle up? And then, the launch kind of just happens and it's covered on the news and we move on to the next thing. So to kind of bring the discussion back to thinking about our audiences, I think we have to be thinking constantly about not just who our audiences are, but how do we make things exciting for these audiences that are being bombarded with something spectacular having to do with space at least once a week, when just a few short years ago it was much less frequent than that. So we have to try to not be routine in our communication at all in order to try to stand out in this kind of a landscape.
Yeah, I would actually argue that right now is probably the most prime time for communicators to get into this market. The technology exists to get us there. We saw that this morning, but there's still that huge gap. I mean, we're very much still in the early adopter phase where it's just for the elite, but there's just this huge gap between, that elite and the general population. And, we really have to get everyone on board. And I think it's a great opportunity to get, a larger audience into this. conversation. But I think there are still some challenges. I think enough people feel like space isn't real or space isn't safe. And again, the technology exists, but there are just all of these, questions that need to be answered. And yeah, I think now's our time.
That's great. I'm going to check out the chat box in just a moment. So if you do have questions, please throw them in there. I just want to kind of throw something at this panel real quick, because I'm reminded as you're talking about, is it boring? Is it exciting? How do we break through? Those are all really, really wonderful questions. I have a couple of friends who worked at JPL, and I don't know if I realized this. I knew that there was going to be, the helicopter that went to Mars. I knew that was happening. I didn't realize that a lot of that was done by people like in their pajamas in their room because they had to work from home because of COVID. Like when I heard that story, I was like, that's incredible. Like, I know we've sent things to other planets before, but like, that seems to me like such a monumental human endeavor. Are there stories like that that kind of get buried when you have like you mentioned, billionaires duking it out for supremacy? And are there ways to surface those things about the people who do space?
Yeah, just to jump in on that, Jordan. So the program office I work for at NASA enables all of NASA's IT. And so for the last 17 months or so, NASA has pretty much been on mandatory telework, different levels, but to some extent or another, NASA has had the majority of the workforce working from home. JPL is a little bit different in that they're tied to us, but they're also kind of part of Caltech, and they have their own kind of IT support. But if you look at the last 17 months and the amount of missions that NASA has accomplished, the SpaceX launches, Mars Perseverance, the landing of the rover, and then of course the Ingenuity, the helicopter taking flight, the majority of those activities were done with the majority of our workforce working from home. So COVID has been a tremendous factor in everything that we've done over the last 17 months or so, and it hasn't slowed us down at all. In fact, it's been something that we've had to accelerate on, while we've been dealing with all of these missions. So there is an aspect of kind of routineness in the sense that, the same way that we're all joining Zoom meetings, there are personnel at NASA that are joining Zoom meetings right now to discuss about spacecraft and launches and other things. And, we always kind of make some jokes about, we want to make sure we always lock our computers up so our cat doesn't get on the keyboard and kind of change the trajectory of a spacecraft. That probably couldn't happen, but you never know. So it has been kind of spectacular to watch how much has actually been accomplished, despite the fact that a lot of us have been working remotely.
Yeah, we incorporate a lot of these into our, sorry, Dave. We incorporate a lot of, our folks have been working from home as well. All our mission operations people have as well. In June last year, we launched 6 high-resolution satellites on 2 different launches across 2 SpaceX launches, which not only included launching the satellites into a lower orbit and then getting them up to a higher orbit, which is inherently a risky thing to do, but also we lowered the entire fleet from a higher orbit to a lower orbit to get to higher resolution with our satellites, something that we don't think there's any commercial precedent for ever having done, just because of the risk it exposes the whole fleet to. And yet that was all done remote. And that was never the plan, to do those things remote. And so to me, that's just, we communicated that as, this is a part of what makes commercial space so incredible. And the innovation that's there is that we're able to do these things in this day and age. And it showcases just the agility with which our organization has and others have, and that agility translates into, assurance for a customer, knowing that we're resilient and can bounce back from things. So we tucked it all in, and we talked to press about it. We highlighted that and made a big thing of it, and it was well covered and talked about, because it kind of just painted this great picture of what commercial space has become and what makes it special.
So I'll jump back again to something Lila said about this being the time for communication in space. Wholeheartedly agree. And in some ways, space is almost too easy to communicate about. These things are inherently spectacular, right? Billionaires launching on rockets and spacecraft circling the Earth and Mars and the Moon. The trick for us, and the challenge for those of you in the audience here today, as you think about a career, is how do you tie that spectacular to the practical, right? And so that's what we're talking about here, of course. And at Astroscale, one of the things we've done is made sure to highlight on our website and social media the breadth of expertise that we have in the company and the people who embody that expertise beyond the engineering team. So making sure that people know that in order to make a great company, space company run, we need marketing and comms people, of course. We need finance people. We need policy people. We need administrative and events people. We need all the kinds of people that make other industries go. Space is not different in that way. And I think something to note when you consider a career in space and the fact that we really do need this diversity of expertise and of just people, and we need great storytelling is 2020, as we all know, the past 18 months was incredibly difficult for many industries in terms of economic downturn, job loss, et cetera. Space actually saw a record year for investment by some measures, and hiring for highly skilled positions in a variety of categories continued even through the pandemic. So in addition to all of the great points that have been made here about being able to do the job from home and this conversation about the diversity of expertise, space is kind of an economic anchor in some ways, and investment and interest from those who understand its value remains pretty strong.
That's a great point. And because of our schedule, I'm going to turn a little bit to the chat. And the first two questions are excellent. This is a pretty US focused panel, an event that was just on purpose primarily for time zones to coordinate everybody. But of course, we recognize that space is a planetary interest. So these first two questions here really do relate to the international situation. So we'll jump in. The first question from Mark here is, how can we explain that space tech helps to reach the 17 SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals? And I'll welcome the panel to answer that question, but also to get back to that, how is space helping Earth? Are we building space just to leave and then that's the end of that? Nice to see you later, Earth? Or how is it really coming back and affecting people's lives in a positive way?
Well, yeah, the first one, and Sylvester may be able to speak more to this because it's NASA's world, but in order for us to figure out how we're going to reach those goals, we have to measure along the way. And Earth observation, which is an increasing piece of NASA's business, is what's going to give us so much of the data that helps us both realize what we need to achieve and then see if we're actually making progress. So I think it's a fascinating world unto itself, the science that's taking place in space, looking back at us to help us figure out then, are we actually achieving the things that we need to under the sustainability goals?
Yeah, and I'll just mention, Mark kind of invited me to do it, so I'm just going to list off a couple of inventions that are from NASA. So miniaturization, so that of course has everything from camera phones to computer mice to laptop computers, artificial limbs, baby formula, freeze-dried food, memory foam, wireless headsets, jaws of life, home installation, infrared thermometers, dust busters, water purification systems, foil blankets for emergencies, cushioning for athletic shoes and seating. That kind of goes back to memory foam. LEDs, CAT scans, and scratch-resistant lenses. These are just a handful of inventions from a PDF I pulled from JPL of things that were invented for the space program that the IP for was kind of basically turned over to the public domain from NASA. So the return on investment in the space program from just those handful of inventions, I think is off the chart. So the argument can certainly be made. These billionaires are going to space. What about the focus on the Earth? And I think there's some validity to that, but I also think that investment in space programs in the U.S. as well as in other countries has also benefited here at home significantly, just from those kind of handful of examples.
I'm going to cue Trevor up here because I think Planet probably has quite a bit to say on this topic. But the pandemic illustrated the value of having this sort of detached infrastructure that looks down at the Earth and tracks things like logistics chains and population movement and disease movement and other crises. During the pandemic, especially, I think this was illustrated. There was commentary in the media about what space was providing during the pandemic. And I think when we consider pandemics, we consider climate change, we consider other humanitarian crises, we need in the space industry to be messaging the way that the perspective from above or outside the Earth helps us a great deal here on Earth with the challenges that we face.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And we when the pandemic was taking off, we were sharing images of just how the cities had changed as they went into lockdown and commerce stopped and activity stopped. We were able to see that. Of course, it isn't obvious that you can see a virus from space because the virus is very small, but you can see the impacts of what that virus is having on communities. And then even looking out further, the UN is using space-based imaging to identify communities where the next outbreak might occur, because the human community is very close to the wild community, essentially, is for the diseases that come out of zoonotic diseases, anyway, that transfer over into the human population from the animal population. So they're looking at those instances where, especially in countries that are growing really rapidly, all of a sudden there'll be a community up against a jungle that wasn't there the year before. And so being able to see those things and monitor those and identify where the next outbreak might occur is another way that space-based data is being used. But back to the SDGs, it's something that's key to the company. Planet was founded because they wanted to help address the first set of UN goals, the Millennium Development Goals back in 2000. And then now with the SDGs, right, being in space gives you a perspective that is completely unique. It's also a global perspective, and these are global problems, and so you need a global perspective and a global set of data to help measure them effectively and in a consistent and universal manner. So you're not using different data sets for different parts of the world that don't exactly line up or measure well against each other, creating imbalances. So yeah, there's a lot of advantages to going to space to do these things. And I also saw a question about security clearances, and I'd be curious if Sylvester requires a security clearance for his work, but I know obviously in the commercial side, I don't have a security clearance. I think out of 600 employees at Planet, probably less than 5% have one, just by the nature of our work. So, and that includes obviously all the engineering side, most of the engineering side, but then of course on the comm side, we don't need one. So really only if you're working in an agency on certain types of subjects, a government agency on certain type of subjects, would you need a security clearance?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor, for addressing that, because I was kind of chomping at the bit to answer that too. I don't have one. The majority of people that I work with don't have one, and we don't need one. The majority of work that's performed at NASA is not classified. There are things that are done that sometimes require what's called as a public trust, which is relatively easy to get. It's basically a history of your previous addresses and people that you may have associated with in 5, 10, 20 years ago, and they do some quick verification and background, but it's not as strict as it is, for example, on the DoD or in the Department of Defense side. Having worked in defense before, you're not working necessarily on things that have to do with the national security apparatus. So the different levels of secret or top secret clearances at NASA are definitely not as emphasized as much as they are on the DoD side.
I'd like to actually hop back to the advantages point real quick, and then I'll hop back to this one. So I think obviously the technological advances are undeniable, but I think there's also and it was interesting because both, I watched both the launch of the Virgin Galactic flight and then also the Blue Origin flight. And, I was kind of trying to compare and contrast the different messages that both groups had. And, different approaches, but one thing that both newscasts discussed heavily was this idea of, well, it's a theory called like the overview effect, which is the idea that once you see the Earth from above, it completely changes your perspective on the globe, humanity, all of it. You sort of see it all as one. And apparently, this is something that only astronauts can experience, or people who go to space can experience. But I think having people going into space and sort of experiencing this and seeing humanity in just that little small floating orb, in the universe, it just, it changes us, who we are. I think it can, evolve how we think in a lot of ways. So I think that's a pretty cool advantage. So coming back to the other point about security clearance and all that, a year ago, I would have never guessed that I would be in this industry. I came from the automotive industry, long story, but it's been such an incredible learning experience. I thought, space just, was NASA. I thought that was the only, outlet to space. And I'm learning so much. I've learned, how many different companies touch it, and been reading a lot about how it won't just be space companies in the near future. It will be all companies, all industries will have some touch point to space. So yeah, it's not just NASA, it's not just security clearance.
It's great. What a wonderful place to pause for a moment. So we have a couple more questions that have come in on the chat relating to how they get into the space industry itself. We are going to cover that a little later in the event, so I'm going to come back to those questions a bit later, where we'll talk a little more practically about that. Right now, I'm going to describe kind of the next section of the event for today, which is our breakout rooms. We will take a break before this, but when we come back, we will split into some breakout rooms. So please stick around for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have some scenarios that the panelists and I have worked together on to throw at you, test your space skills, test your communication skills. It'll be a fun activity. Then we'll come back and get some feedback from the panelists on that. And then, as I mentioned, we'll close out the event talking a little bit more about how getting into the space. So it is 3:43 Eastern, 12:43 Pacific. We're going to come back in about 7 minutes. So right on 3:50, 1:50. I'm sorry, 3:50, 12:50. Arts major. 3:50, 12:50. Come back and we will tell you some more, open up the breakout rooms, and then we'll dive in. But for now, go please use the restroom, grab a drink, and we'll see you in just a little bit. So as I mentioned before the break, we are now going to set up our breakout rooms. Simone, hold on one second before you do that. Let me just describe a little bit about what's going to happen, and then we'll have everybody kind of placed into those. So we have come up with three different scenarios that communication folks might find themselves in working in space. So your mission is to read over these scenarios, work with your team to come up with a response. You're welcome to Google around for the answer. This is not like a secret. Please do some research if you'd like. You'll come up with a response and place it into a document that we're going to post into the chat. We just posted it right now. So those scenarios are listed out there right now. You'll be placed in a breakout room that'll be matched to one of those scenarios. So read it over. Let us know if you have questions. Our panelists are also going to pop in and out of these breakout rooms to help out here or there. Of course, I forgot to swear them to not giving you the exact answer, but they are there to help out if you have any questions about space, or maybe you want to brainstorm some ideas. So let's go ahead and open those breakout rooms now. Go ahead and click on the link in the chat to see the scenarios, and we'll see you back in about 25 minutes. I think we're all back from the breakout rooms. Hopefully that was a fun, if brief, exercise. So now comes the part where we kind of review what we did. So hopefully each group has selected someone who can present. And what we're going to do is just have, we'll go in order here. So we'll do group one first. We'll have group one present what they had, and then panel, please feel free to jump in with your thoughts after the presentation, see how they did. So group one, please take it away.
Well, so I don't know that we selected me as the person. That's the one thing we probably didn't do, but I'll let Lila jump in if I missed anything. But we had a great discussion about you know, what scenarios should be played out for this sort of an issue. How much of it should be pre-planned? How much of it is kind of, you know, in the moment? But I think the most fun that we had during our breakout was talking about the tone of the messaging. You know, how lighthearted or not lighthearted, you know, should it be? So I'll actually turn it over to one of our group members if they've got it noted down. I think Susan, may have noted down the exact tweets and messaging that we would want to send in for this scenario.
And before we do that, for the other groups who may not have read this scenario, what's happening here is your company has thrown a satellite into orbit on a rocket. That rocket is now possibly, or you're preparing for the possibility of a rocket in an uncontrolled descent towards Earth. So this is the scenario that folks are in. So go ahead, Susan.
I will also add that the rocket is not ours, just the payload is ours. So tweets are, check this website for live updates. This can include anything that sort of shows the path. It could be information that's ongoing. Number two, bad news. We goofed and a big satellite is hurtling to Earth. Good news, chances are it will land in the ocean and there will not be aliens on board. Number three would be follow the path, which would have an infographic or something so that people can easily see the trajectory of what the satellite would be taking. Number four, we made it, we didn't crash. Pound mission almost accomplished. And number five, tweet, we're hosting a live chat on Twitter to answer questions about this issue. Join us in 2 days as we track the debris and answer your questions.
It's a lot of different strategies employed there. So panel, any feedback on that? Any of those tweets? That's not a problem. I'll go first. So I'll be honest. I'm not sure if I would have read a tweet that said, "Good news, chances are it'll land in the ocean." In terms of this thing that's hurtling towards, I don't necessarily understand and worry it might fall on me. What was the thinking behind that? It's obviously supposed to be funny. Seems kind of risky in this scenario, no?
So we were at the house, Charlie, by the way, regarding the whole landing and so I personally, and it was else as well, the whole issue that happened with China and their satellite coming or hurtling out of space. This was just a couple of months ago. And so the big question in the media was, where's it going to land? And it was a big nothing burger. People were not concerned about it because the messaging that went out like immediately was, it's probably going to land in the ocean, right? Most of the planet is water. So it's kind of that. I think we kind of tend to underplay what people understand. I think most people get that most of the planet is covered with water and that there's a very slim chance that it would hit. So it was meant to make it more infusing the reality, which is that it probably will land in water. And, you know, it's just sort of making it a little more lighthearted. But I guess maybe we struggled with that. I don't know.
Yeah, what do we think? And we'll open this up to anybody in terms of that approach, because we have kind of like informational, just check it out, see where it's going, to kind of don't worry about it, it's going to land in the ocean, to hooray, everything was fine, don't look over here. What do we think is most effective in scenarios like this?
I think the underlying theme here is transparency and just acknowledging that it's happening and then giving people all of the information they have available, and then making sure people can track what's happening in real time. And I like the live chat tweet at the end. So I think all of these, you know, they could they could be beneficial in kind of a social media campaign if they were positioned where it felt pretty chronological. So I think it could work. I don't know if I would use humor because that can really backfire. That's probably my only thought.
Yeah, that was gonna be my only one, is that, yeah, you are setting yourself up that if anything at all goes at all wrong, you're gonna multiply probably the blowback if you've taken a light approach to it. I definitely agree with, you know, transparency and be as open and get the facts out there quickly. But that would be my one caution on the humor. Love humor when you can use it, but gotta be careful.
Yep, I would add, don't take for granted what the audience might know or not know. Don't take for granted what might or might not concern the audience. Transparency is great, as is education. Uncontrolled reentries of the upper stage or the upper part of a rocket are actually pretty common. But just telling people that and then patting them on the head and say, don't worry, probably not enough. Taking that extra step to say, you know, let's describe the risk, the probability that something would actually happen, and help you understand what's going on here, rather than either patronizing you or assuming that you already know or don't care.
And Dave, you know, using that most recent example of the rocket, the news media really picked that up, and that was kind of all over the place. Is that something to think about ahead of time too? Like, what if, regardless of what the information is out there, if it's kind of a fun story for the news media to talk about, you know, it's kind of like a sweepstakes. Where is it going to land? It's sort of irresistible for press in some ways. How do you diffuse that and you know, bring it back down, take the sensation out of it?
I think it's always good ahead of and I like how you all played out or planned out several scenarios. I think it's always good to think about which media, one, have the audience and the reach that you'd want to get your messages to and through, and then two, what kind of relationship do you have with them? If you can put yourself in a position of being a trusted provider of useful information to them ahead of time, you are going to do yourself a lot of favors when they actually begin to publish information about a situation like this. You don't want to be on your heels, particularly if you could have avoided it. If you knew, and again, you know who those people are, start figuring out how to set up those stories ahead of time to the extent that you can.
And I would jump in and add, bring in external viewpoints, third-party stakeholders, experts, right? Those can be your greatest asset, because if the company's defending itself, obviously the company has its own interests. But if you have, you know, a professor somewhere who's an expert on the subject, they can chime in and provide that sort of color and guidance that helps tamper things down. They can also, you know, they can do that via their own channels, assuming they've got, you know, maybe a sizable social media following, but you can also refer media to them and say, hey, here's an external expert. This person knows what they're talking about. You know, this is their perspective. And so that helps educate. I know when that did happen, I was getting, because I'm the resident space person in my network of friends, I was getting tons of questions. And is this a real deal? Is this a real thing? What's happening here? So yeah, people are generally concerned. But there's a lot of great space experts out there that you can rely on who can sort of educate folks.
Great. So Mark Meyer, looks like your hand is up, and then we'll go to group 2.
I just want to say the Chinese, they had a very bad press when they had the first accident with a rocket. But afterwards they say, okay, we will have a start, and it might be in the Chinese Ocean, so be aware with your chips. So this was really a part of good guidance where they make it before. So if you know you will become in trouble, so tell it before, that everybody can recognize it and be prepared.
And that goes back to transparency too. You know, if you kind of see this kind of thing coming, make a virtue of that, put the information out there. So hopefully to tamp down rumors of alien invasion and whatnot. All right, so let's turn over to group 2 and let's correct my mistake on group 1. And group 2, if you wouldn't mind presenting, maybe first let the other groups know, kind of summarize your scenario that you were working on before you give your solution. So do we have a spokesperson for group 2?
Okay, so you're spending my tax dollars on Mars is what it's called, right? NASA's ready to go into Mars and the technology is ready and Congress has approved the budget and it's going to be the biggest space exploration in ever, right? Finally going to Mars. And there has to be a message that goes out to the US. And so we had to identify 3 audiences for this message. So we split the audience between the yays and the nays, and then we just went for the younger demographic. So Generation Gamma, which is our kids' grandkids. So like the really young kids, the people who are the future of space exploration, and the people who will have the jobs in space that haven't even been invented yet. So we identified them, and then the educators that will continue, teaching those kids about the new frontier and everything. So the message for this group is, it can be anything. It's the sky's the limit, right? So we're trying to get them involved with what's going on and get them behind the whole endeavor. Does anybody else want to talk about audience number 2? Group 2. Okay. So we've got our highly technical audience, folks who will have jobs out in space, and a non-technical audience. So like Leela was mentioning, the plumbers and the folks out there that are actually going to do that blue collar work, because they will be integral to the mission. And then other countries that also have similar goals and financing. So anybody who's in that, like, yay, let's go to space, like that's that key demographic there. The people that are excited about it. And then the message, looks like someone's writing, is just that people will have an opportunity to have a positive impact on their own world by undertaking the greatest engineering challenges humanity has ever undertaken. So really, it's just a big cheerleading rah-rah. Like, let's get on board. Let's see what humanity can do. You can be a part of something interesting and amazing. Okay, audience number 3 is the detractors. This is America. So we've always got our folks who oppose everything. But also it's, putting so much budget into this endeavor certainly is going to have a lot of people questioning why we would spend that money in space as opposed to just spending it on Earth. And so our group talked about how spending money in space will actually improve life on Earth because of that cross collaboration of the inventions that are made. And then also we can talk about how the kids are inspired to go into space and combat climate change and benefit everybody, all of humanity. Anyone have anything to add?
Everybody's so shy in group 2. Thanks, Alyssa, for running us through that. It sounds like you've got 3 very different audiences here. One, just to kind of summarize maybe. So we have some folks who are going to grow up where space is kind of normal. And so now it's about kind of pulling them into this new future. The second group of people, maybe they care about space, maybe they don't, but there might be some job opportunity or some just general opportunity for themselves in this, whether or not they're engineers. And then the third folks, people that like don't want this to happen. So you have to give them other reasons why this is important. Panel, what do you think of the solutions here? Does that sound right to you?
Well, and I know, like, as you sort of just stepped through them 3, when it also, if you look at the messaging, then corresponding, it goes from very inspirational to very concrete. from as you go down 1, 2, 3, it gets more and more concrete. And so I think it's really a nicely way that they structured it, understanding that, you know, who is it that's going to be receptive to something that's a little more amorphous and inspirational, and those that really you're going to need to show me type of thing to get them to act. So I like that structure, both in terms of the 3 different groups and the spectrum of messaging from inspirational to concrete.
Yeah, Alyssa, I think you did a great job, and your group as well. The one thing I would add, though, you know, and I know it's probably just a matter of time, but when you're, and I don't want to get too much into political communication, but you know, when you look at NASA, so NASA is not just one entity, right? We have 11 centers across the country, and we're in Houston, Texas, we're in Huntsville, Alabama, we're in DC, we're in Ohio, we're on the West Coast, and we're in Maryland, and of course in Florida at Cape Canaveral. So depending on where the work is going to be performed, there's all kinds of ways to get people who are mad about the tax dollars that are being spent supposedly on another planet excited about it, because the tax dollars are actually going to be spent in their backyard. You know, the phrase is all politics are local. I can give you the example here in Huntsville, Alabama. So Marshall Space Flight Center at NASA is working on the Artemis missions, and of course that includes the return to the moon in 2024. And so, you know, the folks here could easily be angry about any sort of tax incentives that may be being given to Blue Origin or the other companies that are setting up shop in the local community. But I think the messaging that's been done here, both by NASA as well as the local chambers of commerce and kind of the other interest groups, have been really effective in showing, you know, this stuff is going to eventually go to the moon and maybe onto Mars, you know, in another couple of years. But the money that's being spent to develop the technology and the people that are moving into the area to work on that stuff, there's a lot of benefits that come to the local community from that work. And so you have to be very conscious of that. And I think you have to try really hard to make things practical for people, that, you know, where it's going, the output at the end is really not as important as where the people are going to be located who are working on it, and the benefits that are going to be realized for the local community from that work. And I think NASA's got a hard job of that, because there's 11 different centers that are located across the country. But then at the same time, we've actually got an easier job of it, because we know exactly which interest groups across the country that we need to target to get communities on board and excited about the work that will eventually be performed.
That's great.
That's a great rundown, Sylvester. I've read about this too, as spaceports start popping up around the globe. Because of where they end up located, far away from city centers, you're kind of bringing industry into places that maybe you didn't have it before, and you run into a lot of this. So a lot more fodder there for us to discuss. But we will go on to group 3. So group 3, I think Kelly is going to be the spokesperson here. If you wouldn't mind running us through the scenario real quick, and then your responses.
Okay, so essentially come up with reasons for parents of K through 12 kids in an underserved area why they should consider space as a potential for their future children. And so we were supposed to come up with 4 key messages to kind of respond to the question, are our kids really going to be working in space, from the parents? Messages that our group came up with. Number 1 was getting a STEM education can prepare kids for all kinds of jobs, but they really need people from all kinds of majors. People from different backgrounds working towards a common goal allows them to achieve great things. Our second key message was that the benefits of interdisciplinary nature of space create well-rounded educational experiences and allow people to pursue several avenues. The third message was that diversity is that your voice counts. Humanity needs to grow and prosper through space exploration, and that their kids would be a part of that. The fourth key message was that a lot of unsung heroes need their stories to be elevated, and it's important to tell those stories, not just about like the astronauts who land on the moon or anything or on another planet, but telling aspects of unsung heroes. So we talked about like the movie Hidden Figures, or the women who sewed, like hand sewed astronaut suits a long time ago. And that was our 4 key messages for the parents.
Thank you, Kelly. Panel, any response to this approach?
Well, thank you for putting that together. I think you guys did a great job here. I think one of the challenges always is, communicating sort of the bigger picture, right? Inspiring people and sort of getting them to emotionally connect with a message or an idea, or, the purpose behind, why they're doing what they're doing. But I think especially with something that's so unknown and new, they really also need the facts of, why a STEM education is important, and, what are the job opportunities. And so I think you guys touched on that pretty well here. But yeah, maybe a little bit more of like the, bringing in some more facts and figures around, how much growth will happen in the space industry by, the time their kids are graduating from high school. Something like that might be good too.
I really like to build on Lila's comment. Your first message about a STEM education opens up all kinds of opportunities to you. Of course, we on the panel are biased towards space, but making sure that kids are putting themselves in a position to have a variety of opportunities is incredibly important. Like that a lot. I think if you've followed the news about investment, you've seen that investors are considerably more interested, as are shareholders, in sustainability. How are companies committing to sustainability? And of course, generations coming into the workforce now, and I'm going to guess in the future, have made it clear that sustainability and the ways that their companies engage in sustainable practices are incredibly important to them. They can actually be a differentiator for someone to decide whether to go work for one company or another. And we've already talked here today about the ways that space is a really important contributor to quality of life here on Earth. And so I think connecting those dots, maybe for students, for kids, and saying space. Let me back up and put it this way. We've got some serious challenges here on Earth, some of which are our own making. Space, we still have a chance to get a lot of it right, and then to use a sustainable approach to space to help improve the sustainability of life on Earth. And I think that's a message that could potentially resonate with people who have experienced lives where resources are maybe less abundant than they are, where they've been underserved, as the scenario describes. So another thought there.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Other thoughts on group 3's work from the panel or anyone else? Okay, I don't see anybody going off on mute. So I'll just do a quick comment, and then I'm going to throw another question back to the panel as well. First of all, well done all around. You are all now space communicators. Congratulations. You've done it. I hope that was entertaining and brain teasing for you. Obviously, in a career in space, you're going to spend more than 20 minutes thinking about this, but hopefully that's a kind of whet your appetites a bit. One thing I'd like to emphasize before we go to this next question is that as communicators, one of the best things that we can do is go to people where they're at and try to connect to where people are. That's what we're actually doing with this whole event today, is trying to go to communicators where they might be at. So in a situation like this, think about communities that have been ignored by technological advances in the past, or by economic renewals in the past, or by racism and sexism and all the other isms that have affected people across this country for a long time. as Dave said, maybe with space, we have a chance to get this right. And maybe we can start including people from the get-go and not having to go back and fix something later. That's an important message I think that we should probably think about throughout a lot of work that we're doing. Okay, so you've practiced being a space communicator, you've heard from the panel. I want to now throw the questions similar to the ones we got in the chat earlier back to the panel. Folks in this call, they all want to work in space now, I'm sure of it. What's some steps that they can take? What's the best way to get started?
So I'll go first. One of the things I was struck by coming into NASA from some of my previous jobs working in aerospace and defense and for management consulting is that a lot of the skill sets are actually the same. NASA is not that different from any other organization. So, there's obviously the perception campaign for NASA has been very effective in that, there's a lot of really smart people working here, but that doesn't mean that you have to be, the top 1% of your class to come get a position at NASA. NASA needs communicators, NASA needs facility management, NASA needs IT people, everything that a large organization needs, NASA needs. So when you think about communication, there are so many communication functions that NASA performs, not just for the public, but internal to NASA, internal to our audiences and our stakeholders, that you can very easily get involved with. When I say easily, my path into NASA was actually as a contractor. So I was interested in coming down to the Huntsville, Alabama area. I just did a search on Indeed, and I found that at a Marshall Space Flight Center, there's an Office of Strategic Analysis and Communications here that needed somebody that could perform external and internal communications for the IT office here. And that lined up with some of the experience that I already had in my background of doing communications for the IT offices at Patent and Trademark Office and National Institutes of Health. So, obviously there was a little bit of overlap between my previous experience and the need for this position. But NASA's got a good amount of contractors, and it's getting hired into a contracting company that performs work for NASA. It's pretty much like getting hired anywhere else, except your work environment and your customer is NASA. You've got a NASA email address, a NASA badge. You're not treated any differently than a NASA employee, a full-time federal employee. And then the path into the agency, once you're a contractor, is something that I've seen a lot of people do, even in my short time here. So, looking at it from the outside, it can seem like this kind of, unscalable wall to try to get into either space or a space agency. But there's a couple of different ways that you can approach it if you kind of just keep your eyes and ears open and think creatively. And most importantly, I would say, leverage the strengths that you already have, rather than focusing on where some of those gaps might be, because you might actually find that those gaps are really not that big.
So out of approaching an 18-year career, which don't do the math, please, in terms of what that means for how far along I am in life. But I only started in space 3 years ago. Now I'm an Air Force kid, so I've always had a love of loud, fast flying things, but I didn't get into space in earnest until 3 years ago, 2 companies ago, where space was just one little thing that this large and very diverse company was doing, diverse in terms of its missions or its service areas. And I saw the opportunity to support the development of their commercial space strategy, which excited me because I'm into space. And I'm, as Jordan said, I know everybody here is now too, but 2, because I saw they really needed help with sharply articulating exactly what their value proposition to space was. And that was something that I could do. That's my background, communications, messaging. I think there are so many companies, space is commercially is exploding. There's so much commercial growth, and even existing companies are changing the way they're engaging audiences that need someone who can bridge their technological capabilities and the things that they say about them with really sharp messaging. Space may be the best industry in the world at telling incredibly fantastic stories and having nothing but PowerPoint slides to back them up. at least on the commercial side. So as a communicator, what you can be is both an enthusiast, but also you can avoid being a Kool-Aid drinker, and you can say, let's really sharpen what we're telling people about the value proposition we have to offer. And a lot of, at least in the commercial side, a lot of startups they won't be hiring for titles that fit exactly what you're looking for or think you fit in, or maybe they're not hiring for those at all. But if you can demonstrate that you can provide that value in sharply articulating what they have to offer their customers, their stakeholders, the world at large, you're going to be seen as a valuable asset to them. So that's what I would emphasize is enthusiasm for the industry, but honesty and sharpness in talking about what is it that you're actually offering.
I'll jump in on Dave's point there because it kind of echoes what I was going to say, which is, interest. Because if you're interested, you're inherently going to be more passionate and well-read on the topics relevant to space. But then also to his point about messaging, space and any space agency or company will have no shortage of engineering brilliance and math whizzes, but they're going to need people who can tell great stories. And being able to tell great stories, I think, starts with being able to write really well. Because even if you revert to 280 character tweets or slide decks within the communications field, it all requires great storytelling. As some of the most difficult storytelling is brevity, and being able to write short, concise messaging and storytelling there. So it isn't about maybe being able to write great prose, but starting with being able to write well kind of leads to a great path of doing all the other components of great communications and storytelling, and understanding what makes a great story and a strong narrative, and what will resonate with people and compel them to believe in what you're doing and to understand your mission and your objectives. So that's where I'd start. And then internships, vote with your feet. If you want to be in space, find the great space companies that you think are compelling or interesting, or space organizations or agencies, and apply, intern, volunteer, and just get the experience. And you increase your likelihood of working in space greatly.
Echo Trevor there. So I actually started at Headline News in my journalism career, and writing 10-15-second, telling a news story in 10 or 15 seconds is a great skill. And now obviously people get to learn that doing Twitter, but the fundamentals and the basics. And then what I look for when we're hiring people are that, plus the passion that they are interested in the subject matter, like Dave mentioned. And one of the thing though also to consider is look at suppliers, because sometimes that may be the way to get in. That there may be a marquee company that you really would love to, but it's tough. But maybe there's someone down a tier that is in that business, and it's a place where you can demonstrate that you understand the subject matter, that you can tell the story, and actually make connections across the industry that people will then go, hey, by the way, we now have a opening here, and it's someone who you've been working with. So you can sort of broaden your scope. There obviously the marquee companies that are great to get to, but sometimes working with one of those smaller ones, you get to do more stuff earlier on, and can build your portfolio that'll help you move along.
That's great. Lila, anything? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I guess I'm last. I agree with everything that everyone said, and if you're a good communicator in your industry that you're in now, you'll be a great communicator in any industry. So that includes space, obviously. And one thing for the short amount of time that I've been in this industry, one thing I've learned is that people in this industry are lovely. It's a lot of really enthusiastic people who care deeply about something bigger than themselves generally. And it's been great. It's a very tight community. So, if you use LinkedIn, even just reaching out to someone you don't know that's in the space community is usually willing to chat with you briefly, about what you're doing, what you want to do. I have a couple stories I can share about people coming into the industry from outside of the industry, myself included, but there's a recent one that I want to share because I think it's a good example. someone that's actually working on our team, she came from the oil and gas industry, and she was fascinated by space, had recently lost her job, and she just started attending different space events and reaching out to different space nonprofits and started volunteering. And just she had an interest and an enthusiasm. And, you know, before we knew it, she was an integral part of this small event that we produce on a monthly basis. Jordan, is it okay if I plug my event real quick? So it's called Conversations for the Future. We do it on a monthly basis, and we invite a lot of really great speakers to talk. It's a 2-day event, and generally focus on sort of near Earth, near term, space infrastructure development. And that sounds kind of boring and technical, but we really try to make it accessible to everyone. So we have segments about space news and segments about entertainment in space, and it's pretty digestible for everybody. But we've noticed a lot of people coming to these events who are outside of the industry. You know, it's not, you don't have to be an aerospace engineer to understand what we're talking about. Thanks for the comment, Dave. I agree, space infrastructure is not boring. But yeah, so that the website for that is, I'll drop it in the chat here. It's F4F space/conversations. So yeah, it's a very warm and welcoming industry, and you'll find a place if you want one.
Yeah, and actually, while we're plugging, thanks, Lila, for blazing the path. The company I work for, Media Fusion, has 2 openings. One is for a communication strategist. Actually, there's 2 openings for communication strategists, and the other opening is for a writer editor, based here at Marshall in North Alabama in Huntsville. I will drop the name of our company in the chat, and most likely the positions will have to do with either STEM outreach or working on the Space Launch SLS program that's based here out of Marshall. So I will drop the URL in the chat as well.
That's great. I wasn't going to put everybody on the spot to see if they had jobs available, but any other panelists out there, if you have stuff, please throw it in the chat. We're almost out of time, so I want to take just a moment to address one last question we had in the chat I saw come around off of something I believe I said earlier. So I'll just read it real quick. So, question leading from the previous statement that space, we have a chance to get things right from the get-go. Recent events have shown that space is more and more becoming a billionaire's playground. How do we balance this and ensure equitable growth? I'm going to throw that out to the panel. This will be the last question for today. So does anybody have any thoughts about this?
I believe I'm at least one of the people who said we have a chance to get things right. So I feel like I'm on the hook to provide a thought. Those stories, I think, and you, I think you're probably making this point, Pratesh, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. But those stories, I think, are exaggerated in terms of the number of those stories and how much of the total space activity and the value of space to life on Earth they actually represent. They are big stories, but there's so much going on in space that has nothing to do with billionaires going into it, going into space. I think we have to continue to tell the stories about the value that space provides to life on Earth. And I think I think exploration and human spaceflight, going to Moon and Mars, are incredible, but I'm so much more interested in what space is currently doing and can do, things we haven't even thought of that space can do for life on Earth. And to me, that is the challenge for our industry, is let's keep engaging and telling stories about those services and benefits. Frankly, most of us, for generations to come, are probably not going to go to space. And it's not just the technical challenge, it's the economics of it. I'm highly skeptical that any time in the next few decades, you're going to see a price drop where most of us could go, yeah, I'll fly to space. Like you're flying to, Seattle or something. The stories, the overwhelming majority of stories need to be about the value it's providing to life on Earth.
I'll just echo that, what Dave said, which is that what you're seeing is the buzz and hype of the current media cycle. And I think that we just have to take it with a grain of salt, because it's only a flash of time. And, there's far more investment and energy going into space that have nothing to do with space tourism currently. And so I think that you can see that all the data bears that out. So it may look that way, but really, I think this is just a moment where these guys get to go to space and take some selfies. But at the end of the day, for the long run, the folks who are involved in space and who are working in space have, I think, some pretty great and powerful ambitions that are going to have some really big impacts here, both on just humanity, the environment, but then also quality of life, just in the sense of what the technologies are going to kind of come to bear for us. So I'm optimistic.
I'm optimistic as the last thing our panel says for today, because we are almost out of time. Big thank you to everyone who was involved in this, our excellent panelists. Thank you very much. Our team at the University of Washington and at Block by Block, I thank you so much for helping me put this whole piece together. I just want to quickly review a few things as you all are leaving today and you go out into the world and you start applying for your space job tomorrow. Some things we learned from this: you don't need a security clearance to work in space. You don't even have to work at a space company to work at space. You don't have to work at NASA to work in space. Even if you do, you may not even have a comms role about space at that space company. You don't need a science and engineering background, and you have the opportunity to be a part of this giant new industry and this huge movement to go out into cosmos and figure out what's going on up there. You have the ability as a communicator to talk to people about the overview effect and maybe fight back so that the news cycles aren't dominated by stories of billionaires, but are dominated by stories of all the millions of people who are helping make this happen. There's a lot of opportunity out there. So like I said before, I hope this has whetted your appetite for space. If you want to see more events like this from the UW and from Block by Block, please just drop a note in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback. We're also going to throw a bunch of links into the chat as well for the panelists' LinkedIn and some company links. So please continue to do your research, reach out to us. I can certainly be a resource if you'd like. And again, just thank you so much for being here, and see you out there.